They tried to fine her for parking in her own driveway. They didn't know she was the county sheriff, and she wasn't backing down. What started as petty HOA harassment exploded into a national movement for justice. Ready to see how one woman flipped the script? Backhand index pointing down, comment where you're watching from, like this video, share it, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. They thought they were just starting the next chapter of their lives. But their peaceful arrival was about to spark a war. David Miller and his wife Sarah weren't strangers to pressure. Sarah, after all, was a county sheriff with over a decade of experience in law enforcement. David, an engineer by trade, appreciated structure, boundaries, and community. So when they bought their dream home nestled in the tree-lined streets of Pine Valley, they believed they were stepping into quiet suburbia. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. Their neighbors waved, the yard bloomed in spring colors, and Sarah's night shifts ended with a short, peaceful drive home. She'd pull into the driveway in her marked patrol car, sometimes around 4 a.m., grab her duffel bag, and quietly slip inside. By morning, the car was gone, and everything was back to normal. But someone had been watching. And she didn't like what she saw. Her name was Margaret Williams, but around the neighborhood, she was known simply as HOA Karen. The self-proclaimed guardian of Pine Valley standards, she served as president of the Homeowners Association and took her title with the enthusiasm of a small-town dictator. It started with a knock. David opened the door to find a typed notice taped to the frame. Violation, commercial vehicle parked in residential area. Fine, $50. He blinked. Commercial vehicle. Sarah raised an eyebrow when he handed her the paper. This is a police vehicle, she said, more confused than angry. It's part of my job. The county requires me to have it accessible while on call. David shrugged. Maybe it's a mistake. I'll go talk to her. That conversation did not go well. Margaret's posture was stiff, her words clipped. Rules are rules, she snapped. That thing is an eyesore. It brings down the tone of the neighborhood. Ma'am, it's a patrol car, David replied calmly. It's here for public safety. But Margaret had already turned away, muttering something about slippery slopes and setting a precedent. The next morning, another letter appeared. Then another. Despite Sarah's explanations, citations continued to arrive, each more aggressive than the last. Margaret began sending emails to the HOA board, quoting selectively from bylaws and suggesting that no one is above the community agreement. What had started as a misunderstanding was now a full-blown campaign. And Sarah, a decorated officer trained to de-escalate standoffs, knew something Margaret didn't. When pushed too far, she didn't just push back. She investigated. This was no longer about a driveway. It was about abuse of power. And Margaret was about to find out what it meant to challenge the wrong woman in uniform. Margaret wasn't satisfied with a few fines. She escalated. First, she ordered HOA patrols to begin monitoring the Miller's driveway. These weren't real patrols, of course. Just a couple of volunteers with clipboards and cameras who felt empowered to harass. They parked across the street for hours, jotting down times, taking photos, reporting back like Pine Valley was a military outpost. Sarah ignored it. For a while. Until Margaret sent out an HOA-wide newsletter, complete with photos of Sarah's patrol car, her badge number, and an entire paragraph warning residents of unauthorized government vehicles on the block. Neighbors started asking questions. One even knocked on the door nervously one evening, asking if Sarah had done something wrong. Only in Margaret's imagination, Sarah replied, tired. David wanted to file a complaint immediately. But Sarah advised patience. Let her show her hand, she said. The more rope she pulls, the harder the fall. Margaret pulled hard. She launched a smear campaign, sending emails to the sheriff's department, calling Sarah a threat to the community, and hinting that she was abusing her authority. One email even accused Sarah of illegally accessing HOA records. That crossed a line. Sarah had to answer to internal affairs. It was a humiliating conversation for something so absurd, but thankfully, her captain dismissed the complaint within a day. Still, the damage had been done. Margaret wasn't finished. 2 days later, Sarah caught the glint of a camera lens peeking through a bush across the street. Upon closer inspection, she realized that Margaret had installed surveillance cameras facing directly into their property. When confronted, Margaret claimed she had the right to monitor covenant compliance. "This is harassment," Sarah said. "This is enforcement," Margaret retorted. The confrontation happened in broad daylight, in front of half a dozen neighbors. Margaret screamed about protecting the community. Sarah didn't raise her voice. She just stared, quietly, as if memorizing every word. And she was. Because Sarah Miller wasn't just enduring the harassment. She was documenting it. Every email. Every letter. Every recording. By the end of that week, she had 3 folders full. David finally asked the question they both had avoided: "Are we going to fight her?" Sarah looked up from her laptop and gave a small nod. "We're not going to fight her," she said. "We're going to expose her." If Margaret thought she was the only one collecting information, she was about to learn what real investigation looked like. Sarah had dealt with worse than HOA bullies. She began a quiet inquiry, not just into Margaret's recent attacks, but her entire tenure as HOA president. Through county records, Sarah found something disturbing: several amendments to the HOA bylaws had been filed under questionable authority. Without resident votes, without legal review, and most damningly, with forged signatures. Margaret, it appeared, had rewritten the rules of the neighborhood to serve her personal crusade. Sarah shared this with David, who gasped. "That's state-level fraud." "Exactly. And it's just the beginning." They dug deeper. With help from a legal advisor, an old law school friend of Sarah's, she obtained HOA financial records. Over 8 months, Pine Valley had collected more than $15,000 in resident fines. But less than half that amount had been deposited in the HOA account. "Where's the rest?" David asked. Sarah didn't need to guess. Margaret had full control over the collection system. No third-party audits. No board oversight. Just a president who had turned neighborhood citations into her personal ATM. They interviewed neighbors quietly. Some were hesitant, afraid of retaliation. Others opened up immediately, grateful someone was finally standing up. One couple shared how Margaret threatened foreclosure over untrimmed hedges. Another had been fined for a dog barking, while they were on vacation. A pattern emerged: Margaret targeted residents she believed wouldn't fight back. She sent vague threats, manipulated rules, and when challenged, doubled down with intimidation. She wasn't enforcing harmony. She was enforcing control. Sarah compiled a comprehensive file. Forged bylaws, embezzled funds, harassment, abuse of power. All documented. All sourced. All ready. "It's not enough to take this to court," she said. "We need to show the community. We need the people she's bullied to see the truth." And so they began planning for the next HOA meeting. It would be Margaret's last. The day of the meeting arrived, and with it came a buzz that Pine Valley hadn't seen in years. Neighbors who hadn't attended HOA meetings in months, some in years, gathered at the clubhouse. Folding chairs filled the space. Conversations hummed with curiosity. Even Margaret looked surprised at the turnout. David and Sarah walked in together. Calm. Professional. Prepared. Margaret opened with her usual report, mundane updates on lawn regulations and mailbox repainting. But the room was restless. Eyes flicked toward Sarah, who held a binder in her lap. When the floor opened to community input, Sarah stood. "I have a concern," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Margaret narrowed her eyes. About what? About leadership. About integrity. About accountability. Then Sarah opened the binder. She laid out the facts with precision. Forged signatures. Bylaw changes filed without votes. Discrepancies in financial records. Evidence of intimidation. Photos. Emails. Copies of altered documents. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sarah didn't stop. She revealed how funds had been misused, how Margaret's surveillance cameras violated privacy laws, and how residents had been systematically manipulated. David backed her up with charts and spreadsheets, proof of financial inconsistencies. Margaret tried to interrupt. This is slander. Sarah remained steady. It's evidence. And I've already submitted it to the State Attorney General's office. The room went silent. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, neighbors began standing up. Sharing their stories. A teacher fined for a compost bin. An elderly couple threatened over wind chimes. A single mom given a citation for having chalk art on her sidewalk. Dozens of voices. Years of quiet resentment. All rising at once. Margaret stepped back. For the first time, she looked nervous. The board moved swiftly. A motion was made to suspend Margaret pending investigation. The vote was unanimous. By the time the meeting ended, Margaret's reign had collapsed. And Pine Valley would never be the same again. Margaret didn't go quietly. Within 48 hours of the HOA meeting, she was on every neighborhood forum claiming victimhood. Smear campaign, she called it. Character assassination. But her posts only fanned the flames. Residents who had stayed silent for years came forward with stories of her threats, her selective enforcement, her intimidation. Sarah, meanwhile, submitted her full report to the state. The allegations included forgery, embezzlement, harassment, and illegal surveillance. And this time, the authorities took notice. An audit of the HOA's financial records confirmed the discrepancies. Tax filings were inconsistent. Deposits didn't match fines. Several residents gave sworn statements about Margaret's behavior and unauthorized cash transactions. A grand jury indictment followed within a month. Margaret was arrested on charges of wire fraud, tax evasion, and impersonating a public official. Her mugshot hit the news. The local media covered the scandal under the headline, "Sheriff Exposes HOA Tyranny." And Sarah? She was invited to speak at a statewide homeowner rights summit. Her story, once a tale of personal frustration, had become a blueprint for fighting HOA abuse. Pine Valley installed a new HOA leadership team, with bylaws requiring transparency, shared governance, and third-party audits. And in the center of it all, Sarah Miller was named community liaison. She launched workshops on property rights, mediation, and civic accountability. The woman who once got fined for parking in her own driveway had dismantled a neighborhood empire of fear. And she'd done it not with rage or revenge, but with truth. The clubhouse that once echoed with Margaret's clipped orders now buzzed with something entirely new, hope. With Margaret out and an interim board stepping in, Pine Valley faced a turning point. The neighborhood, once ruled by paranoia and control, was ready to reinvent itself, and leading that change was Sarah Miller. Though she was still a full-time sheriff, Sarah accepted the honorary role of community liaison. It wasn't about titles. It was about setting things right. Her first act was transparency. A full financial audit of the HOA's books was launched, this time with an independent, state-certified auditor. The numbers didn't lie. Margaret had pocketed over $18,000 through fines, cash-only fees, and property lien threats. Some funds had even been routed to an out-of-state account under her maiden name. Sarah didn't stop at the audit. She worked with the new board to establish bylaws that required community votes on all policy changes. Quarterly financial reports shared publicly. External oversight for any large expense or fine collections. But the real revolution came when Sarah hosted Pine Valley's first homeowner empowerment workshop. Over 50 residents gathered in the local library's community room. They listened as Sarah walked them through their rights, how to challenge unfair HOA decisions, and when to involve legal aid. She even invited a pro bono attorney to help low-income homeowners draft appeals. Word spread beyond Pine Valley. Sarah was invited to speak at nearby HOA meetings. A YouTube video of her exposing Margaret at the HOA meeting went viral, gaining over 2 million views in less than a month. The clip, titled "Sheriff Shuts Down HOA Tyrant with Facts," sparked online debates about HOA power and abuse nationwide. That's when the governor's office reached out. In recognition of her service, Sarah was awarded the State Civil Integrity Award, typically reserved for lawmakers and state auditors. But no one questioned her worthiness. The citation praised her unwavering commitment to justice, transparency, and the democratic process within civic communities. Pine Valley, once divided by fear and silence, began to thrive. The HOA board became more diverse, including retired teachers, young couples, and longtime residents who once avoided meetings altogether. The tone of gatherings shifted from rule enforcement to community building. And Sarah? She continued her sheriff duties. But neighbors knew her not just as the woman in uniform, but as the woman who had given them their voices back. David built a community garden in their backyard, inviting kids to plant flowers and vegetables. The same spot where surveillance cameras once loomed now bloomed with sunflowers. Margaret's house was eventually sold. The new owners brought a rescue dog, put up string lights, and hosted their first block party. When Sarah walked down the street now, she didn't carry folders of evidence. She carried plates of cookies and flyers for the next workshop. Pine Valley had become what it was always meant to be, a community. And it started because one woman refused to be silenced. 1 year after the fall of Margaret Williams, the Pine Valley community wasn't just surviving, it was thriving in ways no one had anticipated. Sarah Miller, now affectionately dubbed Sheriff Sarah by the neighborhood kids, continued her dual life as a respected law enforcement officer and grassroots civic educator. Her homeowner workshops had expanded beyond Pine Valley, with monthly invites from communities across the state. Even homeowners outside the HOA system sought her advice on how to build transparent, resident-led governing structures. But while Sarah moved the mission forward, it was David who led the local legacy. The backyard garden he'd started had blossomed, literally, into the Pine Valley Co-op garden. What began with sunflowers and basil now featured raised beds of tomatoes, squash, strawberries, and even a composting corner managed by a group of teens. The garden had become a neighborhood hub, hosting weekend potlucks, kids' nature lessons, and moonlit movie nights. One particular evening in July, residents gathered under twinkling string lights as Sarah addressed the community, not in uniform, but in jeans and a tee, holding a clipboard. "We used to be afraid of our own HOA meetings," she said. "Now we turn them into events people actually want to attend. That's the power of truth, law, and community." The crowd applauded. But not all the changes were celebratory. In the months following Margaret's downfall, an investigative journalist picked up the story. Digging deeper into HOA abuse across the state, she uncovered that Pine Valley was not unique. From fake citations to embezzlement schemes, the article exposed a statewide trend of mismanaged and corrupt HOA leadership. The state legislature took notice. Sarah was invited to testify in front of a bipartisan ethics committee. Calm, composed, and clear, she recounted how a sheriff was nearly fined into silence for parking legally in her own driveway. She brought receipts, documents, and the stories of dozens of neighbors who had been threatened with liens, shamed in public emails, or forced into silence. Her testimony led to the passage of the HOA Accountability and Homeowner Bill of Rights Act, which mandated public listing of HOA financials for all registered associations. Limits on executive power within HOAs. Penalties for HOA leaders who alter bylaws without full quorum approval. For Sarah, the law was a victory, but not the finish line. She launched a statewide nonprofit, Homefront Justice. Its mission: to provide legal resources, education, and advocacy for residents facing HOA misconduct. David handled the website, while retired neighbors volunteered to answer phones, manage inquiries, and distribute guides. One story stood out from their early cases. A young couple in a nearby town had received a $2,000 fine for hosting their autistic son's birthday party in their driveway. The HOA claimed it was an unauthorized gathering. Sarah and her team took the case pro bono. Within weeks, the fine was dropped, the HOA board was reprimanded, and the family received a formal apology. The boy got a second party, this time with most of the town in attendance. Sarah didn't just want to win battles. She wanted to end the war. Pine Valley, meanwhile, had become a beacon. Other neighborhoods asked to model their HOAs after it. Local newspapers featured it as a case study in citizen-led reform. The mayor even proposed a Pine Valley Day. During the inaugural celebration, Sarah was asked to give closing remarks. She stood at the podium, sunlight hitting the community garden behind her. This all started because one person thought she had more power than the people around her. She didn't. And when the people stood up, calmly, legally, but powerfully, things changed. We didn't just take our neighborhood back. We turned it into something better. A standing ovation followed. Margaret Williams, meanwhile, had been sentenced to 14 months of probation and community service. Part of her sentence: weekly volunteer work in a neighboring town's garden cooperative. Ironically, she now pulled weeds beside residents whose voices she'd once tried to silence. Sarah never gloated. Justice, she always said, wasn't about humiliation. It was about correction. As the sun set on the celebration, a new sign was unveiled near the community clubhouse, Sarah Miller Community Hall, a place for justice, growth, and good neighbors. David slipped an arm around Sarah's shoulder. "You know," he said with a smile, "all this started with you just parking in the driveway." Sarah laughed. Who knew? But deep down, they both did. Because from the moment the first citation arrived, Sarah hadn't just been defending a parking spot. She was defending the principle that no one, no matter their title, gets to silence what's right. And for that, Pine Valley, and countless communities beyond, would always be grateful. Months after Pine Valley's transformation, Sarah Miller sat in the back row of a packed conference room in Sacramento. Her name was now known well beyond county lines. She wasn't just a sheriff anymore. She had become a quiet force in reshaping homeowner rights statewide. But today wasn't about legislation or testimony. It was about stories, lived ones. She'd been invited as a panelist for the Voices of the Community Summit, organized by a coalition of civil liberties advocates, state officials, and everyday homeowners who had taken on power structures bigger than themselves. David sat beside her, notebook in hand, chronicling everything. Their nonprofit, Homefront Justice, was growing rapidly, receiving over 400 inquiries a week. Cases ranged from illegal HOA home inspections to veterans being fined for disability-accessible modifications. When Sarah's name was called, she stood, walked calmly to the stage, and addressed the crowd. "We're not here today because of titles," she began. "We're here because someone, somewhere, tried to make you feel small in your own home. But when homeowners know the law, and each other, they're not small anymore." The audience rose to their feet. After the conference, Sarah was approached by a retired judge from Northern California who wanted to help her expand Homefront Justice into a legal aid network. The plan? Statewide training programs, a digital app for HOA transparency, and even a legal hotline staffed by retired attorneys. Meanwhile, back in Pine Valley, Sarah's community was buzzing with new energy. The co-op garden expanded. High schoolers led neighborhood recycling initiatives. And the HOA board had grown into a fully transparent, rotating leadership team. But not everyone welcomed the reforms. In a nearby town, a shadowy group of HOA officials had launched an anonymous campaign smearing Sarah's work. Flyers were distributed claiming she was undermining community standards, that she was radicalizing homeowners. Sarah and David traced the campaign back to a lobbying firm representing a group of high-powered HOA developers. The stakes had grown. Instead of retreating, Sarah leaned in. With support from their growing community, they launched a documentary series, Behind the Fence, Stories from HOA America. Each episode featured stories of ordinary families standing up to extraordinary injustice. The series quickly gained traction online and earned a regional Emmy nomination. But the most powerful episode was one Sarah almost didn't include, Pine Valley's own story. At the encouragement of neighbors, she sat down for an on-camera interview, candidly recalling that first moment when Margaret Williams had issued the citation. She didn't see me as someone who'd read the law. She saw me as a woman, as a wife, as someone she could control. That was her first mistake. The documentary not only brought national attention, it brought resources. Donations poured in. A national legal network offered to back homefront justice with infrastructure, funding, and lobbying access. Sarah knew what that meant. This wasn't just about Pine Valley anymore. She now stood at the helm of a movement. On the first anniversary of Margaret's HOA trial, Pine Valley held its second Community Day. This time, every attendee received a booklet titled, Know Your Rights, HOA Edition, written by Sarah and edited by David. Margaret, now fully released from probation, attended silently. She kept her head down. No one jeered. Sarah had made sure of that. When asked privately how she felt about Margaret's presence, Sarah answered, "Everyone deserves a second chance. Even those who tried to take away ours." That night, the mayor awarded Sarah and David the Community Hero Medal, the first dual honor ever given. David, in his speech, said simply, "We never set out to be heroes. We just didn't want to be silent." The crowd roared. But Sarah, as always, stayed humble. Because for her, the goal was never praise. It was protection, fairness, and dignity for every family trying to build a life behind a white picket fence. And as the stars lit up the Pine Valley sky, one thing was clear: this wasn't the end of Sarah Miller's story. It was the beginning of something even greater. It started with a letter. A widow named Alma Hernandez from Modesto had received a $900 fine for a front yard flower box. Her husband, a veteran, had built it for their grandchildren before passing. Now, she was facing foreclosure threats from her HOA. She sent her story to Homefront Justice. Sarah read it aloud over coffee. "She's 71, Sarah whispered. "This isn't oversight. This is predatory." Within a week, Sarah and David were in Modesto, flanked by a pro bono legal team and a retired judge from their network. They held a town hall that filled every seat, and overflowed into the parking lot. Alma spoke through tears. So did others. One man revealed he paid over $10,000 in bogus fines for non-regulation mailbox paint. What Sarah saw that day ignited something deeper. The weaponization of HOA power was not an exception, it was a pattern. David launched a new division inside Homefront Justice, HOA Watchdog. They began building a public database of abuse cases, contractor collusion, and improper enforcement. The data was undeniable. With media attention mounting, Sarah was invited to testify before the state assembly. Her statement opened with a single sentence: "I am here to represent the homeowners who were silenced, fined, and threatened, just for living in the homes they paid for. Her words went viral. Overnight, Homeowner Protection Bill SB 721 gained bipartisan traction. The bill required HOA financial transparency, capped fine amounts, and imposed penalties for non-democratic enforcement. Lobbyists fought back hard. Anonymous threats came through the nonprofit's inbox. One day, their office window was shattered. But Sarah refused to be intimidated. Then, a breakthrough, a whistleblower from a national HOA management firm contacted David. He had proof of widespread document tampering and illegal foreclosure tactics. With this evidence, Sarah's team filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of over 200 California homeowners. The legal battle made headlines. National outlets called it the quiet war in the suburbs. Sarah, always calm, stayed out of the spotlight as much as she could. "This isn't about me," she reminded her team. "It's about changing the rules for the next family." By the end of the year, 3 more states had begun drafting similar bills. Sarah's work had inspired a ripple effect, across homeowner forums, veterans associations, and statehouses alike. And yet, she stayed rooted in Pine Valley. Every weekend, she still helped coordinate the Community Watch program. Still walked with David through the same driveway where it all began. It was a warm summer morning when a young reporter named Lily Jenkins visited Pine Valley. She was writing a feature on the people behind civic change. Her first stop. Sarah and David's porch. Sarah greeted her in a t-shirt that read, "Know Your Rights," the same slogan now printed on coffee mugs, tote bags, and stickers distributed nationwide. But Sarah remained grounded. Lily asked, "Did you ever think that parking a patrol car in your driveway would lead to all of this?" David chuckled. Sarah just smiled. "I thought it would lead to a nap," she joked. But the interview turned reflective. Sarah spoke about leadership, about trust, about how Margaret Williams, despite all the chaos, had accidentally exposed a nationwide blind spot. "She forced us to look," Sarah said. "And then to act." Later that week, Lily's article went live. Titled "The Sheriff Who Rewrote the HOA Rulebook," it garnered millions of views. Invitations came flooding in, national interviews, university lectures, policy roundtables. But Sarah declined most of them. She chose instead to focus on one thing, building a replicable model. With the help of local colleges, they launched Homeowner Justice Academy, a training program for neighborhood advocates. In its first semester, it enrolled 1,200 people from 32 states. They also published a homeowner's field guide. It sold out in 2 days. But Sarah knew their impact wasn't just measured in laws or views. It was measured in the new dad in Arizona who fought back when his HOA tried to ban wheelchair ramps. In the single mother in Georgia who won her small claims case after being threatened with lien placement. In the little girl in Pine Valley who planted her first tree in the community garden and named it Hope. And on one quiet evening, Sarah and David returned to the bench in front of their house, the same spot where, once, Margaret Williams had shouted threats and waved a citation. Now it was peaceful. Calm. Just birdsong and the sound of children playing. David leaned over. "Do you think she ever realized how much she helped us?" Sarah shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe she was just the push we needed." As the sun set over Pine Valley, the last words of Lily's article echoed. When justice starts in a driveway, it doesn't end with a fine. It ends with a movement. Sometimes, the smallest acts, parking a car, planting a tree, asking a question, can spark the biggest changes. In a world full of noise, paperwork, and power plays, it's easy to believe that justice is reserved for courtrooms and suits. But as Sarah and David's journey showed us, justice often begins at home. Literally. The moment Sarah parked her patrol car in her own driveway, she had no idea she was stepping onto a battleground. What followed wasn't just a conflict with one HOA or one Karen, it was a deeper reckoning with unchecked authority, bullying hidden in bureaucracy, and the cost of silence. But she didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. Sarah taught us something profoundly simple yet powerful: knowing your rights is the first step toward reclaiming your dignity. She didn't fight for revenge, she stood for every widow, veteran, and family who'd been silenced, fined, or made to feel small in their own homes. We all want peace. But sometimes peace requires a push. And sometimes, that push is wearing a badge, not of enforcement, but of courage. This story isn't just about HOA abuse or suburban politics. It's about what happens when everyday people, mothers, engineers, grandmothers, decide they've had enough. It's about the ripple effects of one action, one voice, one driveway. And here's the truth for every adult and senior watching: you are never too old, too small, or too tired to make a difference. Sarah didn't set out to change laws. But her refusal to back down changed lives. So whether you're dealing with unfair rules, standing up for someone else, or just wondering if it's worth the fight, remember Pine Valley. Remember Sarah's bench. And remember, when someone tries to shut your gate, maybe it's time to open the door, for others. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so we can keep sharing stories that matter. And before you go, drop a comment below telling us, where are you watching from? Let's keep the conversation going. Because movements don't start with a crowd. They start with you.